All right. Good morning, everybody. I am sorry that I can't be there today. Something came up, but I do want to get started on chapter 45. So if you don't really have a normal do now today, since I'm not there, I would just like you to make sure that you're getting your notebook out and that you are paying attention to the video, or that you are at least seeing what activities and what questions we have throughout the video. I think mostly the big thing that you should worry about is at the end, there is going to be a set of flashcards that I do want you to make, but we'll talk about that more when we get to the end. And so if you're not really interested in like getting through the video, if that's not going to be helpful for you, then you can just kind of fast forward to the end. But anyway, let's get into chapter 45. We're going to start talking about hormones and the endocrine system. So just to get us introduced and to get us started, I have a quick video to show you guys. Now, there is a chance that this video won't play because I am in screen sharing mode. So let's just see how this goes. If this doesn't work, then you can always just search this video. So how does the endocrine system work on YouTube?
Our body is always in flux. When we are cold, our body shivers. When we are hot, our body sweats. Our body engages in these activities to keep our internal temperature constant. This is an example of homeostasis, which is defined as the ability of the body to maintain a constant internal state. One major way the body maintains homeostasis is through the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system of glands that produce hormones to regulate and control bodily activities. The endocrine system controls a number of important functions throughout the body, including growth and development, metabolism, and homeostasis. There are many different hormones in the body, and each is responsible for different functions. Estradiol, testosterone, insulin, growth hormone, and epinephrine are just a few examples of hormones. Although they are involved in different functions of the endocrine system, hormones work in a similar manner. First, a gland detects a change in the body's internal environment. This gland then increases the secretion of hormones, which enter the bloodstream. Hormones travel through the blood and can have potential effects throughout the body. However, hormones will not act on every cell. Hormones activate target cells by binding to specific receptors on the inside or outside of the target cells. When a hormone binds to a receptor, the receptor sends a signal throughout the cell. Just like a megaphone amplifies the volume of a person's voice, a hormone's message is amplified inside the cell. This signal goes a long way. Just a few hormones can induce great change. Once hormones have succeeded in sending their message to their target cells, and in this case homeostasis is achieved, the gland decreases the secretion of hormones. The mechanism by which the gland stops secreting hormones is called negative feedback. What exactly is negative feedback? Negative feedback allows a system to self-regulate a response or output. The following example may help explain. A house regulates temperature using negative feedback. When the thermostat detects a decrease in temperature, it sends a message to the furnace to produce heat. When the thermostat detects that the room temperature has returned to the correct level, it stops sending its message to the furnace. A furnace will turn on and off several times a day to keep the temperature relatively constant. Now let's look at a specific example of homeostasis using a hormone many of you may have already heard of: insulin. Let's say a person eats a meal. As the food is digested and glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, blood glucose levels begin to rise. It is important for this glucose to be removed from the blood, otherwise it may cause damage to important organs such as the liver, brain, and kidneys. Thus, to maintain blood glucose levels, insulin is released from an endocrine gland, the pancreas. The pancreas senses increased blood glucose and releases insulin into the blood. Insulin travels through the blood and binds to receptors in muscles, fat tissue, and as shown here, the liver. Upon binding to receptors, insulin causes an increase in glucose transporters, allowing excess glucose to be taken from the blood and stored in the liver for future use. This uptake of glucose by the liver and other organs for storage restores blood glucose levels to a balanced state. Homeostasis has been achieved. Because blood glucose levels have reached homeostasis, the pancreas will stop secreting insulin. This is just one type of hormone involved in the endocrine system. Remember, glands of the endocrine system send messages to the body in a similar manner. A gland senses a change in the body and secretes a hormone. Hormones travel through the blood. Hormones are receptor specific. A hormone signal is amplified. And finally, hormones are regulated by feedback, many times negative feedback.
All right. So hopefully that was helpful. I appreciate their animations. Even if it's just little pieces of paper, I think it's a very effective way of conveying what the hormones and what the endocrine system is doing. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the different mechanisms by which hormones and the endocrine system work. And we're going to be specifically talking about local regulation versus long-term or long-distance regulation. But before we do that, we just need to review a little bit about signal transduction response, because we are still talking about signal transduction pathways. But because we're getting into the endocrine system, this is where that pathway becomes a little bit more complicated. And so even what I'm showing here, so we have a very simple endocrine pathway. So for example, what the video talked about, like a blood glucose pathway. When you have a low blood glucose content, that's going to indicate to a receptor protein for the pancreas to release glucagon into the blood vessels. That is going to be your stimulus, and then that section is going to be the transduction. So the receptor protein, endocrine hormones released from the cell, and then the endocrine hormones released into the blood vessels. That is your transduction. But then you also have these target effectors. So these are going to be the locations in which the response will stem from. So we're adding on to our original signal transduction response pathway for signal transduction pathways, and we're including these target effectors, okay? And so in this case, the liver would be the target effector, which would induce the breakdown of glycogen, and glucose would be released into the blood. So this is that simple endocrine pathway. We're just adding on target effectors, and then we have multiple steps for transduction now. And really what I want you to notice in the most of these pathways is how transduction, or the sending of the signal, can be increasingly complicated the more we add on and the more complicated the signal needs to be. And you can see this in things like simple neurohormone pathways. So neurohormones are going to be a combination of nervous system and endocrine system working together to produce a response. And so in this case, we have the signal or the stimulus that is received by a sensory neuron. So this is similar to like suckling. When a baby is suckling at a mother's breast, that is going to be the signal or the stimulus. Transduction is going to occur by a sensory neuron. It's going to be transduced by the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And that structure is then going to induce a secretion of oxytocin. In this case, we're looking specifically at oxytocin from the neurosecretory cell. So these neurosecretory cells are going to be a combination of both the hormone and the endocrine system and the nervous system. And so, as you can see, we have this increasingly complicated transduction pathway. The signal and the stimulus and then the response are still happening, but we are just complicating that whole transduction pathway. And as you guys notice, these examples that they give you are going to be really good examples to kind of lock into your brain for the AP test. When you are going through the AP test and they are going to very likely ask you examples of endocrine pathways or hormone signal transduction. These are really, really good examples to lock into your brain and to remember. Again, AP Bio doesn't want you to remember every single hormone pathway that you've ever learned and that is all in the textbook. That's not what they're asking. They want you to remember specific examples that are effective for conveying different pathways. So this would be a good example. Oxytocin secretion by the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary would be a really good example. Finally, we have simple neuroendocrine pathways. So these are going to be even further complicating that transduction pathway. So in this case, we have a sensory neuron that receives the stimulus or receives the signal. The hypothalamus is then going to induce a response via a neurosecretory cell. The blood vessels are going to receive that signal, transduce that signal throughout the body. It's going to be received by an endocrine cell, and then that endocrine cell is going to release a different hormone into the blood vessels to be then received by the target effectors and produce a response. So this is similar to prolactin in, again, breastfeeding. This is a secretory protein that induces milk production via the protein prolactin. Okay. So this concept of signal transduction pathways, there was a lot of research that had to happen in order for these pathways to really be lined out and be really understood well. And what they came across was this idea of water-soluble hormones versus lipid-soluble hormones. And so these are two distinct categories of hormones that respond and affect cells very differently. So when we're looking at water-soluble hormones, these are going to be hormones that have extracellular receptors. And this is because water-soluble, if you think about this intuitively, water-soluble hormones can't diffuse through the lipid bilayer. This is because the lipid bilayer, remember, has extremely hydrophobic tails. So those are going to keep any very hydrophilic molecules from diffusing through the membrane. So these water-soluble hormones have to have receptors on the surface of the cell that will initiate, that says initial, it should say initiate the signal transduction pathway. And so these are going to be things like the hormone epinephrine. So epinephrine, you've also heard called adrenaline. Like I'm an adrenaline junkie. I love my roller coasters. I love anything that spikes that epinephrine response. And this is, you guys can recognize this in yourself. It's going to cause dilation of the blood vessels. The hair on your back of your neck is going to rise. You're going to increase your heart rate. And you know what this response feels like. And this response, this signal of epinephrine, it induces the breakdown of glucose or glucagon. And so this is an interesting, not glucagon, glycogen. This is a really interesting response because if you think about it, when our body spikes an epinephrine, what that's doing is breaking down glucose, and glucose is going to be used to make ATP. So that spike in epinephrine is directly correlating to a preparedness to either fight or flight, to flee from whatever danger we are perceiving in this case. So that response, that fight or flight response, directly correlates to this spike in the breakdown of glucose, which will then produce an excess of ATP that we can use to either run away or to fight whatever threat is in front of us. So it makes intuitive sense when you think about how your body might prepare for a flight or fight response. And this was actually discovered because when you inject a water-soluble hormone directly into the cell, the signal transduction pathway is not produced. So if we were to inject epinephrine directly into the cell, we would not see any of this fight or flight response. We would not see any of this blood vessel dilation or any of that. And this was an indication to the researchers studying this that there was something about the surface of the cell that had to occur, and something about the signal reception that had to occur on the surface of the cell because something inside the cells was not being stimulated. Now, this hormone epinephrine was also an example, a really interesting example, was that it doesn't just stimulate the breakdown of glucose. It doesn't just do that. Epinephrine has a very widespread response, and this is why you get things like blood vessel dilation, you get a lack of intestinal blood flow, and this is because epinephrine actually has different signal receptors, and it can also, these different receptors can be found on different types of cells. So you can see that in this image right here. And so let's look at A real quick, the intestinal blood vessel. When epinephrine is received by an alpha receptor on the intestinal blood vessels, this is going to induce blood vessel constriction, which is amazing because in the exact same kind of blood vessel, just in a skeletal muscle versus an intestinal blood vessel, it induces blood vessel dilation. So the same molecule can induce completely opposite responses depending on what receptor is found on those particular cells and structures. So this was a really big breakthrough for researchers that were studying the transduction of long-distance hormones. And when they were doing this research, they also found that there were some hormones that accumulated within the nucleus of the cells. And so when I say that, what that means is that these hormones were accumulating and they were not being inhibited by any membrane proteins. And so these, they decided, were lipid-soluble hormones. And so these were hormones that could easily diffuse through the lipid bilayer, and their signal receptors were actually found within the cell, and this is often within the nucleus. And these hormones that end up diffusing through the cell were estrogen and progesterone. So that's why I have this picture of estrogen here, is because these hormones, they used estrogen and progesterone as the model hormones to study for lipid-soluble hormones. And so what they found was that when they studied the accumulation of estrogen and progesterone in rats, they only accumulated specifically in the rat reproductive organs. They didn't accumulate in the nucleus of any other organ cells. So this showed that there was a very specific receptor protein because they were getting into the cell. They had no trouble getting into the cell. But this showed that there was a specific receptor protein within the nucleus, and it also was a very specific receptor. It wasn't a generalized response. It was specific to the cells in the reproductive tract. And so this indicated a very specific response, which is induced by hormones. Hormones are always specific responses. And it also showed that this was occurring in the nucleus, and it was not occurring on the cell membrane the way that water-soluble hormones were occurring. So far we've been talking about long-distance regulation, okay? We've talked about water-soluble hormones, we've talked about lipid-soluble hormones, but there is also a large number of local regulatory molecules that come into the endocrine system. And these local regulatory molecules are often considered paracrine signals. And so paracrine signaling is going to indicate hormones secreting hormones that only impact cells near that, paracrine signaling that is only influencing the cells around them. So it's a cell that produces a stimulus that then only influences the cells around it. It is not long-distance signaling the way that we were talking about with lipid-soluble and fat-soluble or water-soluble protein or hormones. And these come in a wide variety of forms. So you can have neurotransmitters, which are basically amino acid derivatives that are part of the nervous system response. You can have cytokine protein transmitters, which are proteins involved in immunity that secrete immune responses to nearby cells when they receive a threatening signal. You can also have growth factors. Now, you guys remember growth factors from learning about plants. And these growth factors are going to have very similar effects in human body systems. And these are going to stimulate cell division and differentiation during periods of increased growth, like during adolescence. And you can also have the release of nitric oxide. Now, this is an interesting molecule because this molecule is released by endothelial cells in the blood vessels in response to low blood oxygen content. So, when the blood has a decrease in oxygen content, nitric oxide can be released into the bloodstream, and this is going to activate enzymes that relax the smooth muscle cells and dilate the blood vessels. That says it should say dilate the blood vessels. So nitric oxide it's an interesting molecule because it is actually the molecule that is really, really important for stimulating male erections. And so when a male gets an erection, one of the things that is going to be produced is this nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is going to increase the blood flow to the penis, and that is going to produce this increased blood flow is going to produce an erection. And so one of the things that Viagra actually does is Viagra keeps nitric oxide from disintegrating too quickly. And so it basically inhibits the breakdown of nitric oxide within the penis. And so that's how it stimulates an erection for a longer period of time than normal, is because it is stimulating or inhibiting the breakdown of nitric oxide within the penis. And so it's a very, very specific, interesting way of regulating that local response. And you can also have prostaglandins. So these are going to be modified fatty acids that are released into the interstitial fluid to regulate cell function in a variety of different ways. And this can have a variety of different functions within the cell or within the body. All right, so we're at 22 minutes. That should be enough for a very short lecture today. So a couple of things. I want to make sure that video that you had at the very beginning, I do want you to have notes on that. I want you to make sure that you understand the basics of endocrine signaling and hormone signaling. And the rest of the period, I would like you to make flashcards of table 54.1 in your textbook. Now, these can be online, these can be Quizlet flashcards or paper copies because it is a big table. It is a large table of endocrine signaling and particular organs that secrete hormones. So this is going to be on your test. This is absolutely going to be on your test, and you need to understand what hormones are being secreted by what organs and what responses those are going to produce. Okay, so you're going to have the rest of the period to make those flashcards, quiz each other on those flashcards. You can use a Quizlet. However functions best for you. I encourage you to handwrite them because, again, I cannot emphasize enough how much handwriting is better for you than typing things into a computer. But I understand you guys are on a time crunch, so feel free to use Quizlet if you would prefer. And you can have the rest of the period to work on those flashcards. So, all right, I hope this was helpful, guys. I will see you tomorrow, and we will continue our discussion of the hormone and endocrine system tomorrow. All right? Be good for the sub. I'll talk to you later.